Welcome. Settle in. There is nothing that needs your attention right now except this voice and this subject, and neither of them is going anywhere. Whatever was occupying your mind before this moment can wait. It has waited before. It will wait again. And in the meantime, we are going to talk about something that is very specific and not at all urgent, which is the smell of medieval streets. This is not a glamorous topic. That is entirely the point. We are going to go slowly through the reasons why medieval streets smelled the way they did, and we are going to take our time with each reason, and we are going to consider the details carefully and without hurrying, because details are where the reality of things lives, and reality, told slowly enough, has a way of becoming very restful. Let us begin. Medieval cities were not designed with waste removal as a primary concern. This is the fundamental fact from which most of the smell follows. When you build a city without a comprehensive system for removing the waste that a large number of people and animals inevitably produce, the waste accumulates in the places where it is most convenient to put it, which are the streets and the waterways and the open spaces between buildings. And accumulated waste, in a climate that is sometimes warm and sometimes wet, produces smell. This is not complicated. It is simply the natural result of certain conditions. But let us be more specific, because specificity is what we are here for. The first and perhaps most fundamental source of smell in the medieval street was human waste. In a medieval town of any significant size, there were far more people than there were latrines of any kind. Private latrines, pits dug beneath a small structure at the back of a property, the waste falling into the earth, existed in many households, but they were not universal, and they were not connected to any system that removed their contents. They filled up slowly over months and years, and when they filled up, they had to be emptied. The people who emptied them were called gong farmers or night soil men, and they did their work at night, partly because working by day in such proximity to waste was considered unseemly, and partly because the smell was so significant that working at night, when other people were indoors and the streets were empty, reduced the social impact. The gong farmer's cart, loaded with what had been removed from a latrine pit, moved through the night streets of the medieval city and transported its contents to disposal sites outside the town, agricultural land where the waste could be ploughed in as fertilizer, or rivers and streams, or simply middens, large heaps of refuse that accumulated at the edges of settlements. The route of the cart left its own trace in the night air, and the disposal site had its own character that persisted for some time. But the latrines of households that had them were not the whole story, because not everyone had access to a private latrine. People who lived in rented rooms in a landlord's property, people who lived in the upper floors of buildings where descent to a ground floor latrine was inconvenient, people who were simply caught outside with no access to any facilities. All of these people disposed of their waste in whatever way was most immediately convenient. Chamber pots were the solution for indoor convenience. A ceramic or wooden vessel kept in the bedroom or on the landing of a staircase, used at night or when a trip outside was impossible. The contents of the chamber pot were disposed of in the morning, or when the pot was full, or when it was convenient. The standard method of disposal was through the window. There were rules against this in many medieval cities. Regulations specifying that waste should not be thrown into the street, or that it should only be thrown at specific times, or that it should be thrown with adequate warning. A shout, Traditionally, before the cascade, these regulations exist in many sets of medieval town ordinances, which tells us that the problem they addressed was real and recurring, and also that the regulations were not consistently followed, because regulations that are consistently followed do not need to be repeatedly reissued. The result of window disposal was that the streets of medieval cities received a daily contribution from above. Not uniformly. Some streets were tidier than others. Some areas of town maintained better standards than others. Some households were more careful than others. But the general tendency was toward a street that received regular contributions from the windows of the buildings that lined it, and that therefore had a characteristic smell that reflected this. This smell was not subtle. It was the smell of human waste in various stages of decomposition, mixed with the other smells of the street, warmed in summer and suppressed somewhat in winter, but never entirely absent. It was not a smell that people in medieval towns found pleasant. They were not indifferent to bad smells, as is sometimes assumed. They found them unpleasant. They tried to avoid particularly foul areas where possible. They complained about particularly bad conditions. But they also lived with it, because they had no comprehensive alternative, and because the unpleasant smells of daily life were simply part of daily life, as they had always been, and as, for most people in most parts of the world throughout most of history, they continued to be. Now let us add the second layer of smell, which was animal waste. Medieval cities contained a great many animals, not the occasional pet, but working animals. Horses that pulled carts and carried riders, oxen that hauled heavy loads, donkeys that carried goods to market, pigs that were kept in backyards and occasionally wandered the streets, cattle that were walked through the streets to market or to the slaughterhouse, sheep and goats in various numbers. All of these animals produced waste continuously in the places where they happened to be, which included the streets. A horse is a large animal, and a horse produces a substantial amount of manure every day. A horse that stands in a stable for part of the day and is walked through streets for other parts of the day leaves its contributions in multiple locations. A city street through which many horses passed in the course of a day received many contributions. The manure accumulated at the edges of the road, or in the ruts made by cartwheels, or simply in the centre of the roadway where it would be distributed by subsequent foot traffic and wheel traffic. Horse manure has a particular smell that is not the most unpleasant of the smells we will discuss. Horses are herbivores, and herbivore manure is considerably less offensive than omnivore or carnivore waste. But in sufficient quantities, in a warm day, in a confined street, with buildings on either side, horse manure was a significant olfactory presence. The manure of pigs was a different matter. Pigs are omnivores, and their waste is correspondingly more pungent. Medieval pigs were often kept in urban backyards, or allowed to roam the streets as scavengers. Pigs will eat almost anything, including other waste materials, and in a city without proper waste management this made them useful as a kind of living disposal system. A pig eating its way through the organic waste of a medieval alley was performing a service of sorts, but it was also producing its own waste as it went, and adding its smell to the accumulated smells of the place. The regulation of pigs in medieval towns is another topic that appears repeatedly in town records, suggesting both the prevalence of urban pig keeping and the recurring problems it caused. pigs were regularly ordered to be kept off the streets. The orders were regularly ignored. The pigs continued to roam. Their smell continued to contribute to the general smell of the town. Cattle being walked to market or to the slaughterhouse contributed not only their manure, but also their fear and distress, which has its own olfactory dimension that anyone who has been around frightened cattle will recognize. The drive of cattle through city streets was a regular feature of market days in many medieval towns, and it transformed the streets it passed through temporarily into something considerably more rural in character. Let us now add the third layer, which is the smell of food production and preparation. Medieval cities had bakeries, which produced yeasty, floury smells that were generally considered pleasant. They also had butchers, which produced the smell of raw meat, blood, and the various byproducts of butchering that are not the cuts of meat. The offal, the fat, the bone, the blood that drained from the carcasses. In many medieval cities, butchers were clustered in specific streets. Practical arrangement that allowed the smells and the mess of butchering to be concentrated in one area rather than distributed through the whole city. These streets had names that reflected their character: the Shambles, or Butchery Lane, or similar. The Shambles in York, for example, was a street of butchers' shops whose name derives from a word for a slaughterhouse, or a bench on which meat was sold. The smell of such a street on a warm day, when the blood and the offal had been accumulating and the flies had been finding them, was not subtle. The butcher's waste went somewhere. The blood drained down channels in the street, either channels specifically cut for the purpose, or simply the lowest part of the road, where liquid naturally collected. The offal and the bones that could not be used were disposed of, sometimes sold to those who had uses for them, sometimes simply discarded in the street or in the nearest waterway. The accumulation of butchers' waste in and around the Shambles was one of the most reliably unpleasant smells of any medieval town that had a butchery district. Fish sellers added the smell of fish. In a medieval town near the sea or a river, fish was a major part of the diet, and fish sellers were prominent. Fresh fish had a particular smell. Fish that was slightly past its freshest had a stronger version of the same smell. Dried and salted fish, which was sold throughout the year, and had been preserved specifically because it could not be sold fresh, had a sharp, penetrating smell that was different from fresh fish, but equally impossible to ignore. The fish market, like the meat market, tended to be concentrated in a specific area, and the smell of that area was known and accepted and complained about in roughly equal measure. Tallow, rendered animal fat, used for candles and for various other purposes, was produced by chandlers in workshops that were another significant source of urban smell. The rendering of tallow from animal fat was a process that produced a sharp, heavy, fatty smell as the fat was heated and the impurities were driven off. A chandler's workshop in full operation was not pleasant to be downwind of, and in a medieval city where the streets were narrow and the buildings close together, being downwind of anything was a matter of only a few feet. Tanning, the process of converting raw animal hides into leather, was one of the most reliably unpleasant trades of the medieval period from an olfactory standpoint. The tanning process used, among other things, urine and dog excrement as processing agents. The smell of a tannery was considered so exceptional that tanners were often required by town ordinances to set up their operations outside the town walls, or at least at the edge of the town downwind of the prevailing breeze. The smell of a tannery carried on the wind for considerable distances. Specifically, the early stages of the tanning process, the preparation of the hide, involved soaking the hide in large pits of liquid that included urine, which had been collected for the purpose. Urine contains ammonia, which loosened the hair from the hide, and medieval tanners collected it in barrels that were placed at street corners for the public to use. The smell of these barrels and of the full tanning pits was the smell of the edge of town in any medieval settlement with a significant leather industry. Fulling, the processing of wool cloth by beating and treading it in a liquid to felt and clean it, also used urine. The fulling mill, later mechanized to use water power, was in its earlier form a building where workers trampled cloth in troughs of liquid, including stale urine. The wool trade was enormous in medieval northern Europe, and fulling was a necessary stage of the production of usable cloth, and so the smell of fulling was the smell of an economically vital activity. Let us now think about the waterways. Most medieval towns were built near water, a river, a stream, a harbour, because water was essential for life and for industry and for transport. The waterway that ran through or beside the medieval town was, consequently, the recipient of much of what the town needed to get rid of. Waste of all kinds ended up in the water. Human waste, animal waste, the waste of butchers and tanners and dyers and fullers, the refuse of the market, the debris of daily life, all of it found its way, through various direct and indirect routes, to the nearest waterway. A river running through a medieval town of significant size was not a clean river. It was a working river, carrying the waste products of the town as well as its trade. The smell of such a river was not the smell of clean running water. It was something considerably more complex and considerably less pleasant. The smell of water that had absorbed many things over a long period of time. Some rivers in medieval towns were improved, channels were cut, waterways were managed. Certain industries were required to locate themselves at specific points along the waterway so that their effluent would not affect the water supply of residents further upstream. These regulations represent an early form of water quality management, acknowledging the problem and attempting to address it through systematic rules. The effectiveness of these regulations varied. The underlying problem, that everyone needed to dispose of waste and the waterway was the obvious receptacle, was not resolved by rules that were difficult to enforce. The river continued to receive what the town gave it. The smell of the medieval river in summer, when the water level was low and the concentration of what it contained was highest, and when the warmth accelerated the decomposition of organic material, was a significant feature of life near the water. Buildings that backed onto the river, and many did, using the river as a drain as were most directly affected, but the smell carried on the breeze and reached further than the riverbank. Now let us think about the streets themselves, the physical surface of the medieval street and what it contained. The surface of a medieval street in a town was not always paved. In many smaller towns and in the poorer or less trafficked parts of larger towns, the street was simply compacted earth, the natural ground, hardened by foot traffic and wheel traffic into a surface that was reasonably passable in dry conditions, but became a different proposition entirely in wet conditions. Unpaved streets in wet weather became mud. Not the thin, relatively benign mud of a garden after rain, but the thick, deep, organic mud of a heavily trafficked surface that had been receiving the contributions of humans and animals for decades or centuries. This mud was not merely wet earth. It was wet earth mixed with decomposed organic material, the accumulated waste of years of street use worked into the surface by the passing of countless feet and wheels. The mud of a medieval street smelled of its contents. In dry weather, when the surface was hard and compacted, the smell was reduced. The material was locked in the dried surface, and the wind could carry it away more easily. In wet weather, when the mud was fluid and disturbed by every footstep, the smell was released more freely, rising with the disturbance of the surface. Walking through medieval street mud was an experience that required specific footwear. The tall wooden patterns, elevated shoes or overshoes worn above ordinary footwear to keep the wearer's feet above the level of the street, were a practical response to the conditions of the medieval street. You did not want to walk with your feet in the mud itself, both because it was wet and because of what the mud contained. The mud stuck to the patterns and to the hems of garments, and was tracked into buildings, and was generally a pervasive problem that was addressed in various ways. Door scrapers, threshold cloths, dedicated areas for removing footwear, and never entirely resolved. The central gutter of the street, the channel down which water and liquid waste was supposed to flow, collected the worst of the liquid material. On a sloping street, this flow was more or less effective. On a level street, the liquid tended to pool rather than flow, collecting at low points and creating areas of particularly concentrated smell. The management of street drainage was a recurring concern of medieval town authorities, and the cleaning of blocked gutters and channels was a civic task that needed to be performed regularly. In streets that were paved, and paving spread slowly through medieval European towns, beginning with the most important commercial streets and the routes of processions. The surface was more stable, but was still the recipient of the same contributions. The drainage between the stones collected material. The stones themselves were sometimes covered in a layer of organic matter that had accumulated over time. The smell might be somewhat different from an unpaved street, but it was not absent. Let us now talk about the smell of animals in more detail, because animals were so thoroughly embedded in the medieval city that their smell was effectively inescapable. The horse was the primary working animal of the medieval city, and horses required stabling. Urban stables were common. Every household of any means that kept horses had a stable on the property or nearby, and the stable contributed its own very specific smell to the neighbourhood. The smell of a stable is the smell of horse manure, horse urine, damp straw, horse sweat, and the particular organic warmth of large animals in an enclosed space. It is not a faint smell. A stable could be smelled at considerable distance, particularly in warm weather. The stable smell was a familiar component of the medieval urban environment. In streets, near large stabling establishments, the inn yards that served as resting places for travellers and their horses, for example, the smell was particularly pronounced and particularly persistent. The ground of an inn yard that had served as a stable for years contained the accumulated waste of those years, worked into the earth to a depth that gave the area a permanent character. Sheep were common in and around medieval towns, particularly in regions where wool was an important industry. Sheep have their own smell, a combination of lanolin, the natural wool grease, and the smell of the animals themselves, which is milder than cattle or pigs but not absent. A flock of sheep moving through a medieval street, as flocks regularly did when being moved between pastures or to market, was an event with olfactory dimensions that lingered after the animals had passed. The slaughterhouse, the facility where animals were killed for their meat, was another significant source of urban smell. In many medieval towns, slaughterhouses were regulated, required to be located outside the town walls or in specific areas where their effluent would cause minimum general disturbance. But the movement of animals to the slaughterhouse and the movement of carcasses from it both passed through the streets, and the facilities themselves were not always as separate from the town as the regulations intended. The smell of blood and the smell of the various processes involved in preparing a carcass, skinning, gutting, washing, combined with the smell of animal fear in the moments before slaughter, to produce a very specific complex of smells that was unmistakable to those who encountered it regularly. Now let us consider the smells that were added by the activities of ordinary daily life, that are less dramatically unpleasant, but contributed to the general character of the medieval street. Cooking smells were a constant feature of the medieval city. The smells of baking, bread, of roasting meat, of boiling vegetables, of frying in oil or fat, all of these drifted from the kitchens and cookshops and taverns that lined the streets. On their own, many of these smells were pleasant. The smell of fresh bread from a bakery was then, as now, a smell associated with comfort and appetite. But cooking smells mixed with other smells. The smell of baking bread and the smell of the street gutter were simultaneously present in the same air, and what you experienced was both together, not either separately. The pleasant and the unpleasant combined into the complex layered smell of the medieval street, which was not purely unpleasant in the way that an open sewer is unpleasant, but was an odd mixture of the appetizing and the offensive that was, for people who lived in it, simply the smell of where they lived. Wood smoke was a constant presence. Medieval buildings were heated by open fires burning wood or peat, and the smoke from these fires emerged from holes in roofs or simple chimneys and drifted through the streets. In still weather, the smoke could accumulate in streets between tall buildings, producing a hazy, smoky atmosphere that added its own layer to the smell. Wood smoke is not in itself a bad smell. Many people find it pleasant in small quantities, but in quantity, in a confined street with limited air movement, it was another element of the dense, complex air of the medieval town. The dyeing of cloth produced vivid colours and strong smells. Dyers worked with natural dyes, woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow, various other plants and minerals, and the process of fixing these dyes to cloth involved boiling and treating the cloth in large vessels of dye liquor. The smell of dye liquor was specific and strong, the various organic compounds involved in the dyeing process volatile enough to spread into the surrounding air. A dyer's quarter in a medieval city was identifiable by its smells at some distance. The brewery contributed yeasty, fermented smells. Beer was the daily drink of much of medieval Europe, safer than water in many urban environments, which is a reflection of the water quality we have already discussed, and the production of beer in large quantities was a constant urban activity. The smell of brewing, of malt and hops and fermentation, was part of the urban atmosphere. Let us now think about seasonal variation in the smell of the medieval street, because the smell was not constant through the year. Summer was the worst season for street smell. Higher temperatures accelerated the decomposition of organic material. Lower rainfall meant that the street was not regularly washed by rain. The heat encouraged flies, which gathered in large numbers wherever organic material was present, and which were both a nuisance and a carrier of disease. The smell of decomposing organic material in summer, in confined streets with poor air movement, was at its most intense. Specific smell of summer in a medieval city was something that contemporary writers occasionally commented on, not with the clinical distance of someone describing it for future reference, but with the immediate response of someone being assaulted by something very unpleasant. The records of city authorities addressing smell problems, ordering clean-ups, imposing fines for waste dumping, are more numerous in summer, suggesting that the summer smell was a more pressing civic problem than the smell of other seasons. Winter reduced the smell somewhat. Cold temperatures slowed decomposition. Frost locked much of the surface material into a relatively odourless state. Snow covered the street and its contents under a layer of relatively clean white, muffling the smell from below. The winter street was not pleasant. Cold, muddy in unfrozen periods, slippery in frost, dark in the short days, but it was less olfactorily intense than the summer street. Autumn occupied a middle position. The rains of autumn began to wash the accumulated material of summer from the streets, which was beneficial in the medium term but immediately released a great deal of what had been locked in the dried surface of summer into liquid form, producing a brief period of heightened smell as the material was mobilized before it was washed away. Spring was complicated. The thawing of winter's frozen material combined with spring rains produced a significant smell event as the accumulated frozen material of winter was released. The spring melt in a medieval city was not merely a meteorological event. It was an olfactory event, the winter's accumulation becoming suddenly liquid and mobile and aromatic. These seasonal rhythms were as familiar to medieval urban dwellers as any other seasonal pattern. The smell of spring mud, the summer's intensification, the relief of autumn rains, the comparative mildness of the frozen winter. The nose adapted to the familiar and noticed. The unfamiliar and the familiar for a medieval city dweller included all of these seasonal expressions of the urban environment. Let us now think about how medieval people responded to these smells, because their response was not passive indifference. The theory of miasma, the idea that disease was spread by bad air rather than by specific pathogens, was the dominant medical theory of the medieval period. From this theory followed a practical conclusion. Bad smells were dangerous because they indicated the presence of bad air, and bad air caused illness. This was incorrect as a scientific matter. Smells do not directly cause disease, though many things that smell bad are indeed associated with disease transmission, but it was sincerely believed, and it drove specific behaviours. People in medieval towns attempted to counteract bad smells with good ones. Aromatic herbs and plants, rosemary, lavender, mint, rue, and many others, were strewn on floors, hung in doorways, carried in small bunches, burned as incense. These aromatic herbs served the practical purpose of making the immediate environment smell better, and were also believed to provide protection against the harmful effects of bad air. Pomanders, balls of fragrant material, often a mixture of aromatic herbs and spices held together with wax or other binders, carried in a perforated container, were carried by those who could afford them as a portable source of pleasant smell to counteract the unpleasant smells of the environment. The word pomander comes from the French pomme d'ambre, meaning apple of amber, a reference to the ambergris that was sometimes used as an ingredient in expensive versions. When people had to pass through particularly malodorous areas, they might hold a bunch of aromatic herbs to their nose, or press a pomander to their face, or simply breathe through their mouth rather than their nose. These were the individual responses to a smelly environment that individual effort could achieve. At the civic level, the response was regulatory. Medieval town ordinances addressing the smell of streets are numerous and provide some of the most vivid evidence we have for the conditions they addressed. Regulations prohibited the dumping of waste in specific locations. They required butchers to clean their premises by certain hours. They ordered tanners to operate outside town walls. They fined people for allowing their pigs to roam freely. They mandated the cleaning of specific streets and waterways. These regulations were not always effectively enforced, and they were not based on a complete understanding of the problem. The miasma theory did not lead to the systematic sewage systems that would eventually be required to address urban smell and disease at their source, but they represent a sincere attempt to manage the conditions of urban life using the tools and understanding available. The cleaning of streets was sometimes a civic responsibility. Appointed cleaners, paid by the town, responsible for specific areas. Sometimes it was the responsibility of the householders fronting onto the street. The obligation to keep the street in front of your house clean was specified in many sets of town regulations. Sometimes it was both, with civic cleaners handling the main thoroughfares and householders responsible for the side streets and alleys. The tools available for street cleaning were simple: brooms of various constructions for sweeping loose material into piles, carts or barrows for removing the piles, channels and gutters that could be managed to direct water flow. Manual labour applied consistently. These tools could make a difference in specific areas and at specific times. A main market street that was swept and had its central channel cleaned regularly was considerably better than an unmanaged side alley. But the constant renewal of the material being addressed, the daily contributions of people and animals, meant that cleaning was always catching up, never getting ahead. The clean street of this morning was the dirty street of this afternoon. This is simply the nature of a shared surface in continuous use. Let us now consider the perspective of someone arriving in a medieval city for the first time. A traveller approaching a medieval city of any significant size was likely to be aware of it before they could see its walls. Not from the sound necessarily, though large cities had their sounds that carried on the wind, but from the smell. The smell of a large medieval city was detectable at some distance, on a warm day, with a favourable wind, perhaps from a mile or more away. This smell was not the smell of any one thing, but the accumulated smell of all the things we have described: the human and animal waste, the butchers and tanners and dyers, the cooking and the brewing and the burning, the river and the mud and the organic material worked into every surface of the urban environment. It was a complex, layered smell, not entirely unpleasant in all its components, but distinctive and unmistakable as the smell of a place where many people and many activities were concentrated. A traveller who had spent days on country roads, breathing the relatively clean air of fields and forests and small villages, would have found the smell of the approaching city notable. Not necessarily disgusting, many components were familiar from smaller settlements, but intensified, concentrated, accumulated. This city had more of everything, including smell. And then they entered the city, and after a few days they stopped noticing the specific smell, because the nose adapted to its environment and found its baseline in whatever was present. The traveller who had noticed the smell on arrival found that after a week they no longer noticed it in the same way. It had become simply the smell of where they were, remarkable background as unobtrusive as the smell of their own house. This adaptation of the nose to its environment is a genuine physiological phenomenon. The olfactory system habituates to persistent smells, reducing its sensitivity to them over time. The people who lived in medieval cities were adapted to the smells of their city in a way that made those smells relatively unobtrusive to them, while the same smells would be striking to someone not so adapted. This does not mean that medieval people were indifferent to smell. As we have noted, they complained about particularly bad conditions. They attempted to counteract bad smells. They had aesthetic preferences for pleasant smells over unpleasant ones, just as we do. But their baseline was different. Their everyday expectation of what the environment smelled like was calibrated to conditions that a modern person would find very difficult, because modern people are accustomed to modern conditions, which include comprehensive sewage systems, regular rubbish, collection, and the general reduction of large animals from urban environments. The medieval urban nose, adapted to medieval urban conditions, was not suffering in the way that a modern person transported to those conditions would suffer. It was simply there, in its world, processing the information of its environment in the way that noses always do. Let us now consider some specific places and how their specific smells were characterized. London in the medieval period was a large, busy city on the Thames, and its streets had the full range of smells we have described, intensified by its size and its importance as a commercial centre. The Thames itself was a significant presence, a large tidal river that received the contributions of the city for centuries and became one of the most ecologically compromised waterways in Europe before the construction of modern sewage systems in the 19th century. The Fleet River, a tributary of the Thames that ran through London, was notorious in the medieval period as one of the most malodorous waterways in the city. It was used as a drain by the tanneries and butchers and other industries along its banks, and its condition provoked complaints, regulations, and attempts at remediation throughout the medieval period. The name of the street, now called Farringdon Road, follows roughly the course of the buried Fleet, which was gradually covered over in later centuries. The shambles in various cities, the Street of Butchers, was consistently characterized as a notably unpleasant environment. In York, the medieval shambles still exists as a street, though the butchers are long gone, and it is now a tourist attraction. Its narrow width and tall buildings on either side give some sense of the physical environment, though obviously not the olfactory one. Paris in the medieval period had a reputation for particularly intense urban smell. Contemporary sources describe the condition of Parisian streets in terms that make their feelings entirely clear. King Philip II of France, according to a medieval chronicle, was moved to order the paving of the main Parisian streets after being affected by the smell of the mud disturbed by carts passing beneath his palace windows. This was the early 13th century, and it suggests that the royal proximity to the conditions of the street was, even then, a matter of some discomfort. The paving of streets, the gradual process by which the main thoroughfares of medieval cities were covered with stone, was a significant improvement in the management of street conditions, though it did not eliminate the smell so much as change its character somewhat. Paved streets drained better, held less mud, and were easier to clean, which meant that the organic material accumulating on their surface was less deeply worked in and more removable. But the contributions continued, and the smell continued, in a different form. Let us now slow down and simply sit with what we have described. We have covered a great deal of ground, or rather a great deal of street. We have gone through the human waste and the animal waste, the butchers and the tanners and the dyers, the rivers and the gutters and the mud. We have thought about the seasons and the regulations and the responses of people to the conditions they lived in, and what we have found is not a world of horror. We have found a world of ordinary life, lived in ordinary conditions that were different from our own. Considerably more olfactorily intense, certainly, but not the unlivable catastrophe that a modern description might suggest. People lived in these conditions, worked in them, raised families in them, conducted business and made art and built remarkable buildings and led full and complex lives. The smell was part of the world they lived in, as unremarkable to them in its constant presence as the air itself. They were not suffering particularly on account of the smell. They were simply living where they lived, in the way that it smelled, as people always do. And the smell itself, considered at this distance, has a kind of historical texture. The texture of a world that was vivid and dense, and full of the material evidence of life being lived very closely, and without the distance that modern systems create between people and the products of their own existence. Medieval cities smelled. They smelled of people and animals and industry and food and fire and water and mud and time. They smelled of the concentration of human activity in specific places and of the limited capacity of those places to process what the activity produced. And now they don't smell that way anymore. The smell of the medieval city exists only in these descriptions, in the records of those who noticed it and recorded their noticing, in the imagination of those who try to reconstruct what those streets were like. It is, in its way, a very complete vanishing. The buildings remain, or some of them. The streets remain, or some of them. But this smell is entirely gone, replaced by entirely different smells, and it takes a deliberate act of historical imagination to recover even the idea of it. This is the history of medieval streets. Now let us go through some of the details once more, even more slowly, because there is more to say, and the night is long, and the subject, while not particularly cheerful, is at least very specific and very grounded, and specificity and groundedness, described slowly, have a way of quieting the mind. Let us return to the street itself. The typical medieval street in a town of moderate size was narrow. The buildings on either side leaned slightly toward each other at their upper stories, a consequence of building techniques that allowed upper floors to extend outward beyond the ground floor, gaining a little space at the cost of narrowing the already narrow street. The sky visible from the street was a strip, not a wide view, and the air that moved through the street was channeled by the buildings into whatever direction the street ran. When the breeze was not blowing, which was much of the time since streets rarely aligned conveniently with the prevailing wind, the air in the street was still air in a confined space, in the conditions we have described, concentrated smells rather than dispersing them. The street held its smell in the stillness the way a room holds the smell of whatever has been happening in it. The ground of the street was uneven. Even paved streets were not uniformly level. The stones settled differentially, creating a surface of small bumps and hollows that collected liquid in the hollows and presented obstacles on the bumps. Unpaved streets were rougher still, with ruts from wheel traffic and indentations from heavy loads and the accumulated reshaping of the surface by water and use. Walking through this street required attention to where you were putting your feet, not the inattentive progress along a smooth modern pavement, but an engaged, responsive walk that registered and responded to the surface underfoot. The feet learned the common routes. This bump here, this hollow there, the place where the stone is slippery in wet weather, the place where the gutter is deeper than it looks. This embodied knowledge of the physical environment was part of what it meant to live in a medieval city. The street was known in the specific physical way of something you navigate repeatedly. Its roughnesses and its particular smells and its usual sounds were as familiar as the furnishings of your own house. When something changed, when a new pile appeared in an unusual place, when a section of street was unusually bad after a heavy rain, you noticed it, as you notice anything unusual in a very familiar environment. And then it became familiar, and you incorporated it into your map of the street, and it was unremarkable again. Let us think about the people who tried to make a living from the smells of others. The raker, the person employed to rake and clear the detritus from streets, was a recognized figure in many medieval towns. This was not prestigious work. It was not well-compensated work. It was work that the people who did it did because other work was unavailable to them, or because the work was in the family, or because any work that fed you was better than no work. The raker moved through the street with their tools, a long-handled rake, a barrow or cart, and collected what needed collecting. They worked before the main traffic of the day, in the early morning, when the street was at its quietest, and when the material from the previous day's accumulation could be gathered before the new day's contributions began. The raker knew the street very well. They knew which parts produced the most material, which parts were easiest to work, which parts were regularly contributed to by which buildings. They had a route, a sequence, a system developed by experience, and they moved through it in the early morning, in the particular smell of the early morning street, with the smell of what they were collecting close around them. At the end of their round, the raker had a cartload of what they had collected, and this cartload needed to go somewhere. In many towns, the material from street cleaning was taken to a designated disposal area, a midden, a dump, a field outside the walls. The cart was pushed or pulled through the streets, past the buildings still sleeping to the disposal site. The disposal site had its own character, accumulated over years of receiving what the town needed to get rid of. It was not a pleasant place. It was the concentration of what the streets contained, removed from the streets and put in one place. The animals that found it useful, pigs, rats, crows, circled and investigated. The smell, particularly in summer, was the concentrated version of the already concentrated street smell. This is what happened to the material of the medieval street. It moved through the raker's cart to the midden, and from the midden, eventually, back into the earth, decomposing into the material that would become soil, the cycle of organic material continuing in the slow way it has always continued. Now let us think about the smell of particular industries that we have mentioned but not fully examined. The soap boiler is one. Soap was made by a process involving wood ash and animal fat, potash from the ash, combining with fatty acids in the fat to produce soap through a chemical reaction called saponification. The smell of the soap boiling process was the smell of the fat and the ash and the chemical reaction between them, which was sharp and alkaline and penetrating. A soap boiler's workshop was identifiable by its smell at some distance. Soap was not universally used for personal cleaning in the medieval period. It was an expense that not everyone could afford, and the bathing habits of the population were considerably less frequent than modern habits. But it was used for laundry and for certain cleaning tasks, and the production of it was a trade in most towns of significant size. The glue maker was another source of significant smell. Glue in the medieval period was made by boiling animal materials, hooves, bones, hide scraps, to extract the collagen they contained. The boiling of these materials was a prolonged process that produced a smell of remarkable intensity and persistence. A glue maker's workshop was considered one of the most unpleasant in the medieval trades from a smell perspective, and glue making, like tanning, was often required to be conducted at the edge of town. The candle maker has already been mentioned in the context of tallow, but let us dwell on it for a moment. Tallow candles. The standard lighting for most of the medieval population, beeswax being too expensive for general use, were made from rendered animal fat, and the smell of tallow candles burning was the smell of animal fat being slowly combusted. It was a somewhat heavy, greasy smell, not unpleasant in small quantities, but notable in quantity or in an enclosed space. Every medieval building lit by tallow candles smelled to some degree of burning animal fat. Every church service held by candlelight, every workshop lit for evening work, every room in which anyone read or sewed or talked by candlelight, added this smell to its other characteristic smells. It was so ubiquitous that it was simply part of what indoor spaces smelled like: unremarkable background, the smell of light. Now let us think about what people smelled like. Medieval bathing practices were less frequent than modern ones, but this is often overstated in popular accounts. Most people in the medieval period did wash regularly, in the sense of washing their hands and faces as a matter of daily routine, and with greater frequency and thoroughness when circumstances permitted. Bathing as a full-body immersion existed and was practiced, though less frequently than daily modern bathing. Public bathhouses, the medieval equivalent of the Roman thermae, though typically smaller and less elaborate, existed in many medieval towns. For townspeople without private bathing facilities, the public bathhouse offered the opportunity for a more thorough wash, and contemporary records suggest that these establishments were regularly used. Going to the bathhouse was a recognized social activity, but regular full bathing was not universal, and even for those who did bathe, the intervals were longer than modern intervals. Medieval clothing, particularly undergarments, which were washed more frequently than outer garments, absorbed body perspiration and were changed and washed regularly by those who had multiple garments to change into. The smell of medieval people was not necessarily the smell of people who never washed, but it was the smell of people who washed less often and who lived in closer physical proximity to each other and to their animals than modern people typically do. The smell of the medieval person in a crowd, in the market, at a religious service, in a tavern, was the accumulated smell of several days or a week since their last thorough wash, modified by whatever they had been doing in the interim, which might have been physical labour of various kinds, and by the smell of their clothing, which had its own accumulated character from days of wear. Perfume and aromatic products existed and were used by those who could afford them, for exactly the same reasons they are used today, to create a pleasant smell, to counteract less pleasant smells, to signal social status through the expense of the materials. Rose water, lavender water, and various other aromatic preparations were available to those with the means to purchase them. They were used on the person and on clothing and in living spaces. For those without the means for purchased aromatics, the herbal remedies were homemade. A pouch of dried lavender in the chest of clothes, dried rosemary hung in the room, fresh herbs strewn on the floor where they would release their fragrance when walked upon. These were practical and widespread, and they modified the smell of domestic environments in a positive direction. But they modified, they did not eliminate. The underlying smells remained, and the aromatics were notes added to a complex chord rather than replacements of what was already there. Let us now visit a specific medieval street and walk along it very slowly. Let us say we're in a medium-sized English town in the 14th century. The main street of the town runs from the marketplace at the centre to the town gate at one end, a distance of perhaps 300 paces. On either side of this street, buildings of timber and plaster stand 2 or 3 stories high, their upper stories projecting slightly over the street. The ground floors house shops, a baker, a cloth merchant, a candle maker, a butcher at the far end near the gate. It is a summer morning. The sun has been up for a few hours and the temperature is already warm. We begin at the marketplace end of the street. The marketplace itself, where we are starting, smells of the morning's activity. The market has been running since dawn. There is the smell of fresh bread from the baker's stall at one end. There is the smell of the cheese seller's goods, a sharp, slightly fermented smell that is pleasant in its own way. There is the smell of the fish seller, whose fresh fish are not entirely fresh, and whose bucket of salted fish adds a sharper note. There is the smell of animal manure from the 2 horses tied to a post near the centre, which have been standing there for an hour and have contributed accordingly. Underlying all of this specific smells is the general market smell, the smell of many people gathered in a space, of various foodstuffs and goods in proximity, of a surface that has been receiving contributions from many years of markets. We begin to walk down the main street toward the gate. Immediately past the market on the left side of the street is the baker's shop. The door is open. The smell of baking is warm and yeasty and distinctly pleasant. It briefly dominates the nose as we pass and then recedes as we continue. On the right, a tanner's cart is parked, while the driver unloads something at the door of a workshop. The cart has recently come from the tannery. It carries the tang of the tannery with it, a sharp ammonia smell that is immediately noticeable. We move past it quickly, and the smell fades over the next few yards, though it does not immediately disappear. The street surface is dry today. It has not rained for a week, and the mud of the central area is hardened into a crust that breaks underfoot into dry flakes. Beneath the crust, however, the material is still the material it has always been, and in the cracks where the crust has broken, a faint smell rises from the exposed interior. Not strong in the dry heat, but present. In the middle of the street, we must step around a contribution left by a horse that passed earlier this morning. Flies are investigating it. The smell is modest. Horse manure is not the most pungent of the contributions we might encounter, but it is there. Halfway down the street, there is a narrow alley between two buildings on the left. From this alley comes a stronger smell than the main street. The alley is a dead end and receives contributions that people find it convenient to make here, and the still air of the alley holds the smell without dispersing it. We do not go into the alley. On the right, we pass the cloth merchant's shop. The smell here is of wool and perhaps of a mordant used in dyeing, a slight metallic, slightly fermented smell that is specific to the cloth trade. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly, just specific. As we near the far end of the street, the butcher's shop is obvious before we can see it. The smell of the butcher in summer, the blood and the fat and the flies that have found the offal, precedes it by 20 yards or more. The butcher keeps his premises as clean as practical, but the conditions of his trade mean that the area around his shop always has this character. We reach the gate. Through the gate, the smell of the town is behind us, and ahead is the fresher smell of the road outside, the fields, the open air. Even here, however, outside the gate in the supposedly fresher air, the road near the gate is not entirely free of the town's character. The road leading to the gate is well-travelled, and well-travelled roads carry what roads carry. And nearby, outside the wall, is the town midden, the disposal site for what the town's cleaning operations collect, so the fresher air of outside the gate is a matter of degree rather than a complete change, but it is fresher. The smell of open fields is present, and the smell of the road, and the smell of the distant hedgerows, and these things moderate what remains of the town smell, and after 100 paces the balance tips definitively in favour of the countryside, and the smell of the town is behind us. This is the smell of the medieval street. Not entirely unpleasant in every moment. Not a uniform assault, but layered, complex, dense, and very present. And now, at this distance of centuries, it is entirely gone. The street we walked exists, or something like it, in some form. But the smell is entirely gone, replaced by the smell of exhaust fumes and chain coffee shops and whatever the modern street in that particular town smells like today, which is its own kind of strange, if you think about it. The smells change, the streets remain in some form, and the people who walked those streets, breathing in what they breathed, lived their lives, and went to bed and woke up and went out into the street again the next day, as we will tomorrow, in our different streets, with our different smells. Rest now. The street is quiet. It is late. Everyone has gone inside. The night air in a medieval town at night was somewhat better than the day air. The traffic had stopped. The market was closed, the industries were banked for the night, and the cool of the night suppressed some of what the day's warmth had encouraged. The medieval night street smelled different from the medieval day street. Quieter, cooler, the smells less immediately intense, and the people in their houses, in their beds, breathing the air of their rooms, which smelled of the fire and the tallow candle just extinguished, and the wool of their bedding and the particular smell of the household that was simply the smell of home. They slept, as you will sleep, in the smell of your own home, which is simply the smell of home, and the night is quiet, and the street is quiet, and there is nothing out there that requires your attention. Sleep now. Good night. For those still awake, the street is still there if you need to walk it a little longer. There is more to say about why medieval streets smelled as they did, and we can say it slowly, in the quiet of the night, as you settle further into rest. Let us think about water, specifically clean water, and how its absence contributed to the smell. The water supply of a medieval town came from several sources, and none of them were reliable in the modern sense of the word. Wells were the most common, holes dug into the ground until they reached the water table, lined with stone or brick, from which water was raised by bucket and rope. Springs, where they existed, provided a natural source of flowing water. Rivers and streams were used directly. Rainwater was collected from rooftops into barrels and cisterns. These sources were adequate for drinking and cooking in the sense that they provided water, but they were not protected from contamination in the way that modern water supplies are. A well dug in an area where the soil was carrying the drainage from nearby latrines was a well that received some of what the latrines contained. The concept that groundwater could carry pathogens from a contamination source to a well was not understood in medieval terms. The germ theory of disease did not exist, but the practical result was that urban wells in densely settled areas were frequently contaminated. Contaminated water did not necessarily smell. The contamination of groundwater by the organic materials from human waste was not always detectable by smell, particularly when diluted in a large volume of water. But the presence of contaminated water in the urban environment was part of the total system of contamination that also produced the smells we have described. When the water in a well was obviously bad, when it had a smell or a taste or a colour that indicated something was wrong, people avoided it if they could and used it if they could not. The identification of bad water was one of the practical skills of urban life, and people who used multiple water sources became adept at assessing which sources were acceptable on any given day. The cleaning of water sources was another civic concern. The orders to clean wells, to prevent contamination of springs, to restrict the use of waterways for dumping, appear in the same kinds of records as the orders about street cleaning and animal management. They represent a recognition of the problem, if not always a complete solution to it. Let us think about the smell of the medieval tavern, which was a central institution of urban social life. The tavern, the inn, the alehouse, depending on the type of establishment, was where people gathered in the evenings, where travellers stayed, where food and drink were sold, where news was exchanged and business was discussed. It was a warm-lit social space, and it had a characteristic smell. The smell of a medieval tavern was a combination of ale, wine if available, food cooking, tallow candles, wood smoke from the fire, rushes on the floor, and people. The rushes, dried grass or other plant material strewn on the floor as a surface covering, were a common floor treatment in medieval interiors, providing some insulation and some softening of the hard floor. They were also a trap for anything that fell to the floor, including food scraps, drink spills, and whatever was tracked in from outside. Fresh rushes smelled pleasantly of the dried grass they were made of. Old rushes, which had been in place for some time without being replaced, smelled of everything they had collected, which was a great deal. The advice to place aromatic herbs in the rushes, sweet flag, lavender, rosemary, was given precisely because the condition of old rushes was a recognised problem. In a busy tavern, the rushes might be replaced relatively frequently. In less well-maintained establishments, they might stay in place for much longer. The condition of the rushes was one of the indicators of the general management quality of a tavern, along with the quality of the ale and the condition of the beds for travellers who stayed the night. The beds of a medieval tavern were another source of smell. Beds that were shared by travellers of varying levels of personal cleanliness in rooms that were not regularly aired accumulated the smells of their occupants over time. Bedding that was not frequently washed had a character that reflected its history. The flea and the louse, both common companions in medieval sleeping arrangements, contributed their minor note to the complex smell of the room. None of this was unusual or scandalous by the standards of the time. It was simply the condition of a tavern bed, as well known and accepted as the condition of the street outside. Let us also think about the smell of the medieval church, which was a very different smell from the street but no less complex. Churches were scented primarily by incense. Fragrant resins and aromatic materials burned in censers during the liturgy, their smoke rising and spreading through the interior of the church. Frankincense was the primary incense of the medieval Western Church, a resin from a tree grown in Arabia and East Africa, traded across great distances to supply the needs of European religious practice. The smell of frankincense burning is sweet, slightly resinous, complex, a smell strongly associated with religious ceremony in cultures that have used it. But under the incense, the medieval church had other smells. Many medieval churches were also burial sites. The dead were interred under the floor or in the walls, and in an old church the accumulated presence of centuries of interments was detectable in certain conditions. The decomposition of organic material over years and centuries produced a faint, earthy, slightly sweet undertone that was particular to old church interiors. Candles, tallow candles in the cheaper parts of the church, beeswax candles near the altar where the smell of tallow was considered inappropriate, burned continuously and added their smell to the incense and the rest. The smell of beeswax burning is pleasant, warm, faintly honeyed, and was reserved for the sacred spaces as much for its smell as for its cleaner burn. The people gathered in the church for a service brought the smells of their daily lives with them. A medieval congregation was not a congregation of people who had recently showered. The collective smell of a large group of medieval people in an enclosed space was real and present, and the incense that the church burned served in part to provide a more pleasant overlay. The combination, incense and candle and old stone and old wood and the assembled congregation, was the smell of the medieval church, distinct from the street but not without its own complexity. let us now think very slowly about one more aspect of the medieval street smell, which is the smell of the animals that were slaughtered within the city for food. The regulation of slaughter within city walls was a recurring concern of medieval municipal authorities. Ideally, slaughter happened at dedicated facilities outside or at the edge of the city. In practice, animals were often slaughtered wherever was convenient, in the backyards of butchers' shops, in alleys near the market, at whatever location a particular transaction brought them. The immediate aftermath of slaughter, the blood, the steam of a freshly opened carcass in cool air, the smell of the released contents of the digestive tract, was brief but intense. The cleaning up of a slaughter site was practical and necessary, but the evidence of what had happened there remained in the surfaces, soaked into the earth of an unpaved yard, worked into the cracks of paved surfaces, for a considerable time after the event. In cities where slaughter happened frequently and in multiple locations, the smell of slaughter was not an occasional event but a regular background element. The market day, when cattle and sheep and pigs were brought to the city, and many transactions of sale and slaughter happened, was a day when this element of the urban smell was particularly prominent. The sounds and the sights of urban slaughter were also part of the medieval city, in ways that would be unfamiliar to most modern urban dwellers. The sound of an animal in distress, the sight of blood on a street surface, these were unremarkable in a city where such things happened regularly. The habituation of the medieval urban population to the proximity of death and slaughter was simply a feature of the food supply conditions of the time. Medieval people were not as a result indifferent to suffering or to death. They were simply accustomed to a closer proximity to both than modern conditions allow, and they processed that proximity in the context of their religious and philosophical frameworks, not with the horror that the same proximity would produce in someone raised in the modern separation from the processes of food production. But the smell remained, the smell of slaughter, the smell of blood on stone or earth, the smell of the offal and the waste of the process. These were part of what the medieval city smelled like. And now we have been through it all. The human waste and the animal waste, the trades and the industries, the water and the streets and the seasons, the tavern and the church and the market. We have walked the medieval street in some detail and considered what was there. And now the street is quiet. It is late. The night watchman has passed and his footsteps have faded. The fires are banked in the hearths. The tallow candles are out. The animals in their stables are settled for the night. The street outside is dark and relatively quiet. The smells of the day somewhat reduced in the cool air and the absence of traffic. The medieval night. Not entirely silent. A city is never entirely silent, but quieter than the day, and you can rest in that quiet, in the historical quiet of a street that has been busy all day and is now at rest. Everything that was contributed to the street today will be there tomorrow, but tomorrow is tomorrow. Tonight, the cool air of the night is as good as it gets in the medieval city, and the streets are quiet and the people are sleeping, and the night is doing what nights do, which is pass slowly and quietly into morning. Rest in it. Good night. On the question of what people noticed. The last thing worth saying about the smell of medieval streets is this. Medieval people notice smell, and they wrote about it, and their writing about it tells us something important. They did not write about it the way we might write about it, with clinical distance or with the assumption that the reader was unfamiliar with the conditions. They wrote about it as people writing about something they knew. The complaints about particularly bad smells in town records were complaints made by people who had a general expectation of what was normal and found specific conditions to have exceeded that expectation. The normal was not a pleasant smell. The exceptional was something worse than normal. The physician who advised keeping fragrant herbs near the nose when passing through certain districts was giving practical advice to people who recognized the problem and needed practical solutions. The advice assumed that the problem was real and that the reader would encounter it. The poet who described a malodorous alley was describing something recognizable to their audience, a specific kind of urban unpleasantness that the audience would immediately understand without further explanation. All of this tells us that medieval people were not indifferent to their environment's smells. They had preferences. They preferred pleasant smells to unpleasant ones, as people always do. They took what steps they could to improve their immediate environment, and they lived with what they could not immediately improve, as people always have. The medieval nose was not a less refined instrument than the modern nose. It was the same instrument, adapted to different conditions, finding its baseline in a different normal. The remarkable thing is not that medieval streets smelled. The remarkable thing is that so much of the rest of life, the art, the architecture, the religion, the commerce, the scholarship, the music, the entire complex of medieval culture, happened in the same streets, breathed the same air, and produced things of lasting beauty and complexity alongside the smell. The smell was simply the background, as all backgrounds are, present but not defining, and the life that happened against it was full and real and human, as all lives are, in whatever background they happen against. And now the background here is the quiet of the night, and the smell here is the smell of where you are, which is your own smell, your home's smell, the particular unremarkable smell of where you live, your background, your normal, unremarkable, because it is yours. Rest in it. It is enough. It is always enough. Good night. The gutter. Let us return to the gutter, because the gutter was perhaps the single most important physical feature of the medieval street from the perspective of smell, and it deserves its own careful attention. The gutter of a medieval street was the low channel running along the centre or the edge of the road, designed to carry liquid waste away from the street surface and, ideally, into the waterways that served as the town's drainage system. In practice, the gutter was imperfect. It was not always well graded toward the waterway. It accumulated debris that blocked the flow. It received material that was too solid to flow. It was inadequate for the volume of liquid that a significant rainfall produced, but it was the system. The gutter of the main street in a medieval town was swept and cleared by the street cleaners and by householders whose properties fronted onto the street, and the material it contained was supposed to flow toward the river or the town ditch and be carried away. When the gutter was clean and flowing, it was performing its function, and the street was somewhat better for it. When the gutter was blocked, the liquid that should have flowed away instead pooled in the low points of the street, forming shallow lakes of a character that depended on what the gutter had been receiving. Maintaining clear gutters was a civic obligation that appears in many sets of medieval town regulations. The obligation fell on different parties depending on the regulations of the specific town, sometimes on householders. For the gutter in front of their property, sometimes on guild members for the streets where their trade was conducted, sometimes on appointed civic officers responsible for specific areas. The effectiveness of this maintenance was variable. In prosperous towns with active civic governance, the main streets were reasonably well maintained. In less prosperous towns, or in times of civic difficulty, the maintenance might fall behind, and the gutters might block and overflow, and the pools might spread, and the smell might intensify until someone addressed it. The smell of a blocked gutter in summer was specific and strong. The material that had settled in the blockage, a combination of organic material from various sources, worked into a dense, slow-moving paste, released its smell freely when disturbed, either by rain or by the probing of a stick or a tool trying to clear the block. The disturbance of a blocked gutter was a brief moment of intensified smell that was immediately recognizable and immediately unpleasant even to those entirely accustomed to the general conditions. After the block was cleared, the flow resumed, and the smell of the specific location improved, even as the material flowed on toward wherever it was going. The gutter was not the only drainage feature of the medieval street. In some towns, particularly well-managed ones, more elaborate drainage features existed: covered channels, multiple gutter lines, drainage structures that directed surface water more efficiently. These improvements were incremental and expensive, built over time as civic resources allowed, in the areas of the town where the improvement was most needed or most valued. The market square might have better drainage than the side alleys, because the market generated a great deal of what needed draining, and the market was used by many people, including influential merchants and civic figures who had an interest in its condition. The side alleys might receive whatever improvement was left over, which was often not very much. This unevenness of civic improvement was a feature of medieval towns, as it is of all towns in all periods. The resources of the community were directed toward the areas and the problems where the combination of need and influence produced the most consistent pressure for improvement. The gutter, maintained or blocked, present in every street, doing its imperfect work. This is one of the most fundamental features of the medieval urban environment, and its smell was one of the most fundamental features of the medieval urban smell. Let us now think about the smell of the medieval house, which was a counterpart to the smell of the street. The medieval house, entered from the street, was a different environment from the street, though not without its own smells. The transition from outside to inside was a transition from the open-air accumulation of the street to the enclosed accumulation of the domestic space. The ground floor of a medieval house in a town was often occupied by the trade, the shop, the workshop, the workspace of whatever the household did for a living. The shop had its own smells, continuous with the trade, which were also the smells of the street immediately outside. A butcher's house smelled of the butchery. A baker's house smelled of baking. A tanner's house smelled of the tannery. The upper floors, where the family lived and slept, were somewhat more separated from the smell of the trade, though not entirely. The smell of the street came in through windows when they were open, and even when they were closed, through gaps and cracks. The smell of the fire, burning in the centre of the room or in a hearth, was constant. The smell of cooking, when cooking happened, was intermittent but present. The bedding, straw or hay mattresses, wool blankets, had a smell of their own, the accumulated smell of many nights of use. The rushes on the floor, if there were rushes, added their smell. The chamber pot present in the bedroom and used at night added its smell, particularly in the morning before it was emptied. The medieval house was not a sterile environment. It was a place of life, which means a place of smell. The smells of the house were different from the smells of the street, but they were present and they were known, and they were, for the people who lived in the house, simply the smells of home. The smell of home is always, for the person who lives there, relatively unremarkable. It is the background against which other smells are noticed. A stranger entering your house notices the smell of your house. You do not notice it, because you are in it all the time. Your nose has calibrated to it and found its baseline there. This is as true for the medieval house as for any other house. The smells of the medieval home were the background smells of medieval domestic life, unremarkable to those who lived in them, noticeable to visitors, and entirely invisible to us now except through the historical imagination. Let us think about what smelled good in the medieval city, because not everything smelled bad. The medieval city had pleasant smells as well as unpleasant ones, and the pleasant ones were noticed and appreciated. The smell of bread baking was then, as now, a smell associated with warmth and nourishment and comfort. A medieval person passing a bakery and breathing in the smell of fresh bread from the open door was having an experience not fundamentally different from the same experience today. The smell of a garden, the herb garden attached to a monastery, the small gardens behind some townhouses, the orchards at the edge of town, was a relief from the street. Gardens smelled of earth and growing things, of herbs and flowers, of the particular freshness of living plant material that is different from everything else the city contained. The smell of a market on a winter morning before the warmth of the day had brought out the worst of the street, when the fresh produce brought in from the countryside was still fresh, and the cold air was holding the unpleasant elements in check. This was a relatively pleasant smell, the smell of fresh food and cold air. The smell of a fire in the cold months coming from a building as you passed, the smell of wood smoke and warmth, was a pleasant smell. The smell of heat and shelter available. The smell of beeswax candles in a church, mixed with incense in the cool interior of a stone building. This was a smell that contemporary descriptions suggest was valued and appreciated. The smell of the sacred space, distinct from the everyday. The smell of fresh rushes, just laid in a well-maintained room. A clean, dry, faintly grassy smell. The smell of clean linen, cloth that had been washed and dried in fresh air. When you put it on, or when you pressed your face into it, a smell of freshness and care. These pleasant smells existed alongside the unpleasant ones, in the same city, in the same day, available to the same nose. The experience of the medieval city was not uniformly unpleasant any more than it was uniformly pleasant. It was mixed, as experiences always are, the pleasant and the unpleasant present together in the complex air of a living place. And the pleasant smells were valued precisely because they provided contrast, because the nose that spent most of its time in the general condition of the street found the bakery's smell, or the garden smell, or the fresh linen smell that much more welcome for the contrast. This is simply how smell works. Contrast intensifies perception. The good smells of the medieval city were perhaps more intensely pleasant, because of the contrast than they would have been to a modern nose already accustomed to an environment of mostly neutral or pleasant smells. There is something to be said for contrast, even in smell, especially in smell. Now let us settle further towards sleep, because we have spent a long time in the medieval street, and the hour is late, and the details have accumulated into something quite complete. We know about the human waste and the animal waste. We know about the butchers and the tanners and the dyers and the chandlers and the fullers. We know about the rivers and the gutters and the mud. We know about the seasons and how summer was worst and winter was more bearable. We know about the responses of people, the regulations, the herbs, the pomanders, the adaptations. We know about the traveller approaching the city and smelling it before seeing it. We know about the nose's adaptation to its environment, finding its baseline in the familiar, noticing only the deviation from it. We know that medieval people were not indifferent to these smells, but that they lived with them because living with them was what living in those cities meant. We know that life was full and real and human against this background, as life is always full and real and human against whatever background it has. And now the medieval street is quiet. It is night. The watchman has passed. The gates are shut. The animals are settled. The fires are low. And the smell of the city at night, cooler, calmer, somewhat reduced from the intensity of the day, is the only smell remaining, and even that is unremarkable to those who sleep through it. They are sleeping, as you will sleep, in the quiet of the night, in the smell of your own home, which is simply the smell of home. Good night. The night watchman. The night watchman of a medieval town walked a specific route at specific intervals through the hours of darkness. His job was to watch for fire, primarily. Fire was the greatest danger to a city of timber buildings, and a fire that started undetected in the night could destroy blocks of buildings before dawn. He was also watching for civil disorder, for unusual movement, for anything that should not be happening at this hour. He walked with a lantern, a small flame in a protective case, giving just enough light to see the immediate path ahead. He walked through the streets that were his responsibility, past the closed shutters of shops and houses, past the sealed gates of yards and gardens. The street at night was quiet. The noise of the day, the carts, the animals, the voices, the industry, was absent. What remained was the sound of his own footsteps on the street surface, and occasionally the sound of something in a building, a person moving, a baby crying, the sound of someone disturbed in their sleep. The smell of the night street was the smell of the day's street minus some of its intensity. The cold of the night slowed the release of volatile compounds from the organic material in the street. The absence of traffic reduced the disturbance of the surface. The absence of the living contributors, the horses, the people, the industries, meant that nothing new was being added. What remained was the accumulated smell of the day, somewhat reduced, somewhat different in character in the cold air. The watchman was accustomed to this smell. He had walked this route many nights. He knew every section of his territory, which buildings, which smells, which sounds were normal for this time of night. His attention was not on the smell, which was simply the background of his job, but on the things that might indicate danger. The smell of smoke, the sight of a moving light where no light should be. He walked, past the baker's, where the cooling oven still gave off a faint warmth, past the cloth merchants, where the shutters were tightly closed and nothing stirred, past the alley that he always walked past quickly, because the alley was always worse than the main street and there was no point in lingering, past the butcher's, where even at this hour the smell of the trade was present, worked into the very surface of the building and the street around it, past the church, where a small light burned in front of the Virgin's image, and the smell of old stone and old incense was the smell of the building, even when no service was being held, and then around, back through the marketplace, and along the other side of the town. He had done this many times. He would do it again. The town slept, and he walked through its sleep, watching over it, smelling its night smells, listening to its night sounds. This is the night watchman. This is the medieval night street. Quiet, cooler, the smells reduced but present, the town at rest, as you are at rest, or becoming so. The watching is done for tonight. The lantern is being carried away, around the corner, into the next street, and you are in the quiet it leaves behind. Dark, quiet. The street smells of the night, which is cooler and calmer and more distant than the day. And in a few hours the watchman will come around again, but that is hours away. For now, the quiet. For now, the night. For now, sleep. Good night. The smell after rain. One more thing. After rain, after a good sustained rain that came down steadily for an hour or more and washed the street properly, the medieval street smelled different. Not clean, not in the modern sense, but different. Washed. The surface material mobilized and carried away, at least in part. The gutters running freely, carrying what they were carrying, moving it toward the river and away. The air cleared of the airborne components that the rain had washed down into the street. The smell after rain was a particular kind of relief. Not pleasant necessarily, but less intense. The rain had reset things somewhat, removed the accumulated load of the dry period, flushed what could be flushed, and left what could not be flushed. And then the fresh smell of wet stone and wet earth, and the after-rain air that is everywhere and always somewhat cleaner than the before-rain air, because the rain has washed particles from the air as well as from the street. Medieval people in summer waited for rain, not with the anxious impatience of people who needed it for crops, though the farmers outside the city needed it for crops, but with the simple recognition that rain would make the town somewhat less intense for a time. And then the rain came, and the street smelled of rain and wet stone and the particular after-rain air, and this was, by the standards of the medieval summer street, quite good. And then the sun came out, and the material in the street began to dry again, and the smell began to build again, and by the end of a hot summer afternoon everything was more or less as it had been before the rain. The relief was temporary, reliefs often are, but while it lasted it was real. The smell of the medieval street after rain, like a breath of clear air, brief, appreciated, gone, as the night is here now, brief, appreciated, and then gone into morning. And the morning will be what it will be, but the night is here now, and you are in it, and the rain has come metaphorically, and the air is clear, and the smell of the night is as good as the smell of the night gets, which is quite good, quite still, quite quiet, and you can breathe it in, the night air, the clear air, the after-rain air that the medieval street occasionally offered to its residents. Breathe it in, and rest, and sleep. Good night. The herbs strewn on the floor. We have mentioned herbs strewn on floors as a way of managing indoor smell, but let us stay with them for a moment, because they are among the more pleasant details of the medieval olfactory world. The practice of strewing aromatic herbs on floors was widespread in medieval Europe. The specific herbs varied by region and availability, but some were nearly universal in their use. Meadowsweet, which smelled sweetly when walked upon, releasing its fragrance from the bruised stems. Lavender, with its familiar clean and slightly medicinal smell. Rosemary, sharp and aromatic. Sweet flag, a water plant whose leaves released a pleasant smell when crushed. Mint in its various forms. These plants were harvested from gardens, from roadsides, from the edges of fields, and brought into houses where they served their dual purpose of covering the floor surface and releasing their smell when disturbed by foot traffic. The smell of a floor freshly strewn with meadowsweet and lavender was by any standard pleasant. The herbs released their fragrance with each step, so that walking across the room produced a small release of scent that accompanied movement throughout the day. Over time, the herbs dried and became less fragrant, and they collected the same debris as any other floor covering, and they needed to be replaced. The replacement of the floor herbs was a regular domestic task, part of the general management of the household, done when the herbs had become old and dusty and no longer released their smell with the freshness of new herbs. The gathering of herbs for this purpose was, in season, a pleasant task. Going to the garden or the meadow, cutting or pulling the appropriate plants, carrying them home, spreading them on the floor. The smell of the freshly cut herbs before they were even on the floor was a good smell. And then on the floor, under the first few steps of the household going about their morning, the smell was released, and the room smelled, briefly, entirely of the herbs, before the accumulated smells of the day reasserted themselves. But in that brief first morning with new herbs, a medieval room could smell quite good. This is a pleasant thing to know. And it is a pleasant thing to let sit in your mind as you move towards sleep. The image of a medieval floor freshly strewn with lavender and meadowsweet. The smell of the herbs rising with the morning footsteps. The household going about its day in a room that smelled, for a little while, of something entirely natural and entirely pleasant. Let the smell of the herbs be what you take towards sleep, not the gutter, not the tanner's cart, the herbs on the floor, the lavender and the meadowsweet, the brief, pleasant, entirely sufficient smell of a floor that someone took care to make smell good. Because people always did that, in whatever way was available to them. They tried to make their immediate environment smell better. They strewed the herbs, they carried the pomander, they burned the incense, they kept the herb garden, they did what they could with what they had to make the space they lived in a little more pleasant. And the smell of those efforts, the herbs, the incense, the garden, was part of the medieval world too. Not only the gutter, both, always both, the difficult and the pleasant together in the same air, as they are always together. And tonight the pleasant is what you carry with you. The herbs on the floor, the clean after-rain air, the smell of the bakery passing, the incense in the cool church, the smell of home, all of it available, all of it here. Rest now. Good night. The distance between then and now. There is a particular quality to thinking about the distant past just before sleep. The medieval street, with its gutters and its pigs and its chamber pots and its herbs and its butchers and its night watchmen, is so thoroughly gone that thinking about it is like thinking about a dream. Not because it was not real, it was entirely real, but because its reality is inaccessible to us in the direct way that the smell of our own house is accessible. We cannot smell the medieval street. We can only think about it, construct it from the descriptions of people who walked it, imagine it from the records they left, and in the imagining, the unpleasant aspects become manageable. They are the details of a story, not the assault of a reality. The gutter described is not the gutter smelled. The description passes through the mind and produces an idea rather than a sensation. This is the particular mercy of historical distance. The bad smells of history are only descriptions. The pleasant smells of history are also only descriptions. And both can be considered in the comfortable way of thinking about things that are not immediately present. As you are not immediately present in the medieval street, you are here, in this room, at this hour, in this century, with the particular smells of here and now and this century, which are your smells, which you mostly do not notice, because they are the background of your life. The medieval street is very far away, as far as anything can be, and the night here is very close as anything can be, and sleep is closer still, right here, at the edge of this moment, available. The medieval street has gone quiet. The watchman's lantern has gone around the corner. The herbs on the floor are releasing their last fragrance of the night. The fire is low, the town is sleeping, and you are sleeping, or becoming so. In the quiet that has always been here, under the smells and the sounds and the details of the day, the quiet that was here in the medieval night, and is here in your night, the same quiet, different time. Rest in it. Good night. One last detail, the rats. Medieval cities had rats. This is not a pleasant topic, but it is part of why the streets smelled as they did, because rats find organic waste very appealing, and medieval streets contained a great deal of organic waste, which meant that medieval cities supported large rat populations. Rats in a medieval city moved through the same system of walls and foundations and underground spaces that the water moved through, and they were present in houses and warehouses and ships and marketplaces and everywhere that food was stored or waste was accumulated. They were a known and managed problem. Cats were kept specifically to control them, and the cat population of medieval cities was sustained by the food they found in exchange for the service they provided. The smell that rats added to the medieval environment was modest. Rats themselves are not particularly smelly animals, being clean in their habits. But the damage they did to stored food and the waste that accompanied their presence was part of the general picture of the medieval urban environment. And the cat that hunted the rat was part of the picture too, a working animal, useful, present in most households, leaving its own small contributions to the indoor environment. The whole system, the rats, the cats, the stores of food they were competing for, the smell of the food and the stores and the animals, was simply part of urban life, present, unremarkable to those within it, part of the background, as everything is part of the background eventually. And now even the rats and the cats of the medieval city are gone, and what remains is the knowledge that they were there, and the imagining of what they contributed, which is not much in the end. Just a small additional note in the complex chord of the medieval street. One more detail, one more layer, And now the layers are complete, and the street is quiet, and the night is quiet, and you are quiet, and the last detail has been noted and set aside, and sleep is here, complete, quiet, available, yours. Good night. All the people who walked that street. All the people who walked the medieval street. The baker in the early morning before the customers came, carrying flour from the storage room to the oven. The apprentice trailing behind, learning the route. The merchant arriving at the market with his cloth. The butcher setting up for the day, bringing carcasses from the back to the front of the shop. The housewife coming out to buy what was needed for the day's meals. The child sent on an errand, who took the long way because there was something interesting at the market. The priest walking to the church for the morning service. The pilgrim passing through, following the road to somewhere holy. The travelling merchant with his donkey and his goods. The gong farmer working before dawn. The raker sweeping the gutter of the main street. The night watchman finishing his last circuit as the dawn came up. The pig wandering. The dog following the pig. All of them in the same street. All of them breathing the same air. All of them accustomed to what was there. All of them going about their lives in the particular way of people going about their lives, which is thoroughly and without much reflection on the conditions around them. The street was their street. The smell was their smell. The life was their life, and it was enough. It was a whole life, full of everything that a life contains, in a street that smelled terrible by our standards, and perfectly normal by theirs. And now they are all gone, and the street is quiet, and it is late, and the last thing to say about the medieval street and why it smelled as it did is simply this. It smelled because life was happening in it. Fully, continuously, messy life, with all its products and byproducts, its people and its animals, its industries and its residences, its better moments and its worse ones. The smell was the smell of life, lived closely, in small spaces, with others, without the benefit of the systems that now separate us from our own mess. That is all it was, life, and life smells. And now your life is quiet, and the night is here, and the smell of the medieval street is very far away, and the smell of your own night is very close, and it is the smell of rest and quiet and the end of a day, and that is enough. It is always enough. Sleep. Good night. The morning after. In the morning after any day in the medieval city, the street was there again. The night had not changed it fundamentally. The material in the gutter was still there, perhaps slightly different in character from the cooling of the night, but still there. The hardened crust of the unpaved sections was still hard, waiting for the first traffic of the day to begin disturbing it. The closed shutters of the shops were still closed, waiting for the first business of the day to open them. The smell of the morning was the smell of the night that had been, cooler, quieter. The accumulated smell of the previous day still present but somewhat reduced by the hours of cold. And then the day began again. The baker opened his shutters and the smell of the first baking of the day came out into the street, warm and yeasty, the first pleasant smell of the morning. The horses were brought out from their stables for the day's work, and they added their smell to the morning. The first carts came through the gates, the market traders arriving with their goods, the horses pulling the loads, the wheels in the ruts of the street. The gutter was disturbed by the first traffic and released the overnight accumulation of smell. The day was beginning. The street was resuming its character, The smells were reasserting themselves, and the people of the medieval city went out into their street and breathed it in, the morning version, somewhat better than the afternoon version, and went about their day, as they did every morning, as they had done many mornings before, as they would do many mornings more, the street and its smells and its life continuing morning after morning for centuries, until it changed, until the paving was complete and the sewers were built and the animals were removed from the urban environment and the industries moved to the edges and the outskirts, and the water was piped in clean, and the waste was carried away in pipes, and the air of the city became what it is now, a different mixture with different smells, better in some ways, different in others, but no longer the medieval street in any way we could recognize, and the people of that changed city walked out into their different street and breathed its different air, as people do in whatever city they have, breathing whatever it offers. And here you are, in your city, or your town, or your house, with the air of your place and your time, breathing it in without thinking about it, because it is yours, your background, your normal, and it is enough. It is always enough. The morning will come, but not yet. The night is still here, and the quiet is still here, and sleep is here, in the quiet air of your own place, your own time, your own night. Good night. The last smell of the day. The last thing a medieval person smelled before sleep was the smell of their own room, the fire reduced to low embers, the wool of their blanket, the straw of their mattress, which smelled of dried grass and the particular warmth of a place slept. In many times, the tallow candle just extinguished, a thread of smoke rising from the wick and then fading. The air of the room, which was a mixture of all these things, and the smell of the person themselves, and the smell that drifted from the street below when the wind was right. This was the last smell of the day, not the gutter, not the butcher, not the tanner's cart. Those were the smells of the street and the daylight. The last smell was the smell of their own room, their own place, their own night, which is the same smell that is the last smell of your day, your room, your blanket, the air of your night, which is yours and unremarkable and sufficient, and in it you sleep, as they slept, in the quiet, in the familiar smell of home, in the night that always comes after the day, and holds you until morning. Sleep now. The street is quiet, the night is here. The smell of your room is the last smell, and it is a good smell, a home smell, a sleep smell. Good night.